So you just filed a provisional. So what should you do during the year of protection? Hello and welcome back to Invent Anything. In this episode, we're going to cover in taking stock of the kind of provision you have, some scenario planning. We're going to cover some immediate actions that you should take. We'll cover what you should do in the first 3 months, the next 6 months, and also then talk about how what you do depends upon the company's point of view. And then we'll talk about how you close out the provisional and then considerations moving forward, even talking about agentic AI. This is John Cronin from Invent Anything, and welcome back.
Inventions keep the world spinning. From fire and the wheel to today's high tech, inventions power change. Turn your inventions into reality. Learn how to get your ideas to market. This is Invent Anything with John Cronin.
Today we'll cover 6 different topics. The first is taking stock. It would be important to ask the question, what kind of provisional did you have? And do a little bit of planning here to ask yourself the question, what kind of a provisional did I file and what do I do? As soon as we do that, we would move to the next step, which is what are some of the immediate actions you can take? A lot of people don't know this, things that you should likely do in the very first weeks of filing a provisional. But then as time goes on, believe it or not, there are things you can do in the first 3 months. And so that's the topic 3. Then we'll move to topic number 4 about what you should do by 6 months. And a lot of times it's really what the company's point of view is, the kind of actions you might take. And then we'll close out the provisional, getting to that point of did you abandon or should you convert to a patent, etc. That would be topic 5. And then finally, in topic 6, we'll talk about something called intellectual asset management. You see, by filing a provisional and considering the things to do over the year, those are internal processes that are allowing the intellectual asset to be managed more properly. And what we're finding today is because of agentic AI, robots are going to be driving these intellectual asset management services. Yes, that means that agentic AI robots will actually be handling what to do with your provisional after you file it. So I chose these 6 topics because I wanted to kind of think about a provisional and how to raise the value of a provisional in your business, and then talk about the future of it. Then, of course, we'll wrap up. Now, in thinking about the audience of the types of people I thought might be interested in this, certainly if you filed your first provisional, you would definitely be interested in this. But also for companies that are startups or small companies, this podcast provides really a well thought out business plan to leverage your provisional. I mean, you spent time to invent it, write it up, you spent the money to file it. So why not think through how to leverage it up mostly? Another thing is from the types of audience that I think might enjoy this is larger organizations. I think there's a real gap because when an inventor with an attorney in a large company files a provisional, they basically sort of let it go and let the company's counsel handle it. And I think that that's really limiting the value of that provisional into the business. If you're an investor listening to this, the podcast should provide you a process that allows you to get the most out of the time and expense that went into the company to get the provisional. If you're a management in the company, you might sort of think about, a solid, rational plan for using this provisional to create real business value. And finally, for all those people like myself, watching how large language models have gone to agentic AI, agentic AI is now impacting intellectual asset management. It'll be great to actually discuss how agentic AI can actually do a lot of the things that we're talking about here in this provisional and podcast. So in our future, I think this podcast, if you buy in on some of these things that you need to have done, you can really just give us a call because we'll have robots built to do most of it. So anyway, this is John Cronin. And coming up, what we're going to have is 2 topics. In the first topic, we'll take stock of what kind of provisional do you have? Things like, did you do it because you were a little bit in trouble? Or is it a patent pending play? Or is it a placeholder for immediate filing? We'll talk about those things. And then in the next topic, we'll talk about sort of the immediate actions you can take. Things like how to create a patent pending position or develop an IP story or develop a patent watch. So stay tuned. So let's jump right in topic number one, taking stock. What kind of a provisional do you have? Well, first of all, just a little bit of background about myself and my company. I've worked with intellectual property for 3 decades now for IP Capital Group, and we have thousands of clients, and almost every client files 1 through 5 provisionals. Sometimes they file 100. So that's our business. So this podcast really captures only a few of the things that I've learned over the decades about how clients leverage provisionals. So it's at least coming from a source, me, that actually has deep understanding about the things you can do with a provisional. So let's take a look at this. Did you file a provisional because it was rushed? That's usually what happens, is you all of a sudden realize you really got to file something, don't have time for a patent, and so you rush through to get a provisional filed. And that's okay, but the combination of getting a provisional filed but then immediately converted to a patent after would be the right and better choice. So if you find yourself in a really rushed moment to file a provisional, that's okay. But please consider sort of the next thing you want to do is file that patent. You may find that if you do them right next to each other, there's much more value than sort of waiting because there's a lot of things you might forget that you want to put into the patent that you were considering when you wrote the provisional. Another sort of area of you know, taking stock is that maybe the provisional is supposed to cover a product. So here's a key rule. If you wrote the provisional to cover a product that later on you're going to try to patent, one of the biggest things we found as a mistake is that people will take the product that they're developing and actually start modifying the product over the year, and then your product moves away from the provisional that you actually wrote to cover it. So don't fall into that trap. Have a process internally that allows you to look at that product and its change against the provisional that you filed. Sometimes companies will file a provisional on a placeholder of the future product, meaning they're sort of taking a bet of where their product or somebody else's product may go. And that's really kind of cool, but here's another caveat. Don't be fooled because basically a lot of people walk away from filing a provisional. They don't understand patent law and they think they have a blanket coverage of the situation. They kind of relax, thinking they're covered. And they may not be for the reason I just mentioned earlier, or for the fact that the provisional really doesn't cover what they think it's covering. So you really need good advice on this between experts and maybe counsel. Another thing to take stock on is if you wrote that provisional because you think you're going to monetize this invention when it gets filed as a patent or somehow monetize a prototype in a provisional in some business case, if this thing is to be monetized, then one of the things you really need to do right away is kind of set up sort of a market watch to see if the value that you have in the provisional really proves out. If, on the other hand, one of the things you did is for prediction of a deal to be done in the future. And a lot of companies we work with will do this. They'll write a provisional because they'll see that if they can get some ownership before they go to a meeting or before they discuss something at a presentation, they want to kind of lock it in so they, quote, own that seed of an idea. If that is true, then what you need to kind of do is see if that seed idea that you have can be set up actually to monetize. So when you're filing the provisional, think about that presentation and how you can make sure they're woven together. But when you're putting the presentation together, figure out how the provisional should overlap that presentation. So what I'm trying to say is you need to sync the concepts of the provisional to whatever that monetization plan is. Don't just write the provisional and then independently go off and think about the monetization play. Now, if you're an investor and you're thinking there's an investor play here, which is a pretty big thing that we do, companies will come to us because they're raising money. And because they're raising money, they would love to have the IP locked in. And that's, I think, one of the most valuable uses for provisional. If that's true, then make sure that we do all the work to get that provisional filed in a way that allows the investor to understand it's an asset. And one of the best ways to do that is to take the provisionals or 2 or 3 or 4 that you file and put together a short story for the investor. Maybe the point of view here when you take stock is this was a trouble play, meaning you wrote that provisional really quickly because you wanted to prove you were the inventor first. Now it's interesting, and you have to understand that one of the problems we have here is that inventorship is a legal question. Inventorship is first to invent, but as the inventor, you have to have ownership of whatever the claims are of the patent, which means in the provisional, you have to write the invention up in such a way that you know that you're the inventor of what's going to be claimed from the provisional. And another thing is, one of the things you have to sort of recognize is that provisionals don't get laid open. So if you're in a trouble play, you may want to file a provisional, make sure you got good inventorship, and then lay it open right away so that you can stop somebody else from sort of creating that next invention on top of you. Now, a lot of times it's a patent pending play. This is a very useful strategy. Like you file the provisional because you can say automatically it's patent pending. And I've seen a lot of things here with this because when you do a patent pending play, put it on your website that you file the provisional, it turns out that you could just say that. You don't even have to put the title of the provisional. If you put the title of the provisional, the title can really say anything. If you ever played that game like Stratego where you're trying to hide the flag and you put some bombs around the flag, it's kind of like this because you can use a patent pending play for misinformation even. But you want to use the patent pending play to stop others maybe from following you or copying you. But it's a great play to take, but recognize it's a very strategic play. And you want to make sure that if you do that, you have to figure out when you're going to continue to file the patent because if it's just patent pending and then you don't go forward, then that's another strategy. Another thing is it could be, if you're taking stock of things, it could be a placeholder for an immediate patent filing. Um, you would think that that would be the only reason for filing a provisional because you get the provisional filed more quickly because a patent takes more time. Now, sort of think about this. If you file the provisional because the patent's going to take more time, that would tell you that something in the provisional maybe doesn't is not in the patent because you would have filed the patent first. So you have to be really careful about what you put into the provisional to make sure that it's going to be put into the patent. And this is a pretty big caveat. A lot of people, when they file a provisional, think they automatically can get the patent they want. If you don't have support information in the specifications of the provisional, you won't be able to get the patent you want. And finally, one of the strategies that we see is using provisionals to sort of add on top of or invent around or underneath the patent pending. So if this is sort of what you're doing, then you need a process to kind of alert yourself because if you've done this, then you want to see if the actual proof has occurred, whether that provisional that was filed did end up inventing on top or underneath. One of the things we found is that when people file provisionals, they file it and forget about it. And it's usually their patent counsel writes them an email a month before the date comes up to file it. So there's lots of reasons here to file provisionals. I've only covered a few of them, but it's going to take stock because by taking stock, you'll see that that has a lot to do with some of the things you take as next steps, which then leads to topic number two. What are some of the immediate actions you could take? Well, one thing you should do sort of immediately, right after the provisional is filed, is to set a date, on your calendar, maybe 3 months from now, but somewhere in that 1 year anniversary to give yourself enough time to file the patent. I would say the latest you should be thinking about the patent write-up is 3 months before the maturity date. So you need to do this right away. Another immediate action you should take is set up an understanding with your patent counsel to understand the claims and costs, etc. Because you want to have in your head how long this is going to take and how much this is going to cost. Because you shouldn't be surprised when you decide to file the patent that now this thing is going to cost a lot more than you thought. So size that right away. Another immediate action is to add, provisionals to the other company's documents. So for instance, if you have NDAs, you can add it to the NDA that you have ownership of invention by file provisionals. Or you might want to add it to a specific document for talking about intellectual property, to investors, etc. So one of the immediate actions is to add that provisional as an asset into other company documents. And I could mention many other company documents, but just for the time here, just sort of think about what documents you want to add it to. A lot of people add it to like a deal that they're doing, like between a vendor and a supplier, etc. Another immediate action to take is to add patent pending to all company documents, particularly the websites or papers or marketing, because this gives you real leverage to say patent pending. It's one of the key reasons for filing a provisional. Another immediate action that we do is develop some short IP story. Maybe even develop a podcast of your technology and your invention, and at the end say it's patent pending. You can use these provisionals to help raise money or do it in advance of an M&A discussion or do it in advance of a large customer who you think might be wanting to copy what you're doing. So that's an immediate action, is to develop a story. Another immediate action that we've seen is that you can lay open your provisional to become prior art. And what this will do is stop others from patenting because you've made the provisional laid open. And I can't get into the complexity here about the fact that you file the provisional, that you do own the fact that you own that technology in the provisional. But another patent could be allowed, and you're going to have to now prove through your provisional and kind of knock out the patent that was allowed. So laying it open sometimes is the best thing to do. Another immediate action you can take is to create a patent watch or prior art watch. You could do this in a Google alert or write some sort of little robot to do this, but it'd be good to actually, maybe every month get a little report about whether or not your provisional is actually doing what you think it's going to do. Watching the prior arts, and if anything happens after your provisional, making your provisional maybe stronger if you kind of producing it, maybe hoping others, you know, might try to copy you. You can look at copycats and see if they are trying to copy you to see if maybe through the immediate action of filing it on your website that maybe copycats have stopped. So there's a lot of thinking there about some immediate actions to take. Another immediate action to take is to uh, sort of every week sort of think about the product you're going to announce and see if you're starting to see evidence of use out there. So if you're starting to see evidence of use that your product is going to be copied or is being copied, your provisional is much more important now because you probably do want to file the patent because you see that it's going to stop somebody else from making, using, or selling. Another immediate action we've seen is that companies tend to file the provisional because they needed to get it in fast, but then they'll take that provisional and invent around it or on top of it to expand the potential ownership around it. And one other immediate action that you might want to think is behave as if you have a patent. In other words, the language and the posture by which you can go and talk to customers or suppliers or investors. The provisional gives you the leverage to actually talk about the fact that you own intellectual property. So one of the almost immediate things you can do after patent pending is to have the sort of headspace, if you will, or the posture to recognize you own intellectual property. So there's just some of the things you could do as immediate actions right after you file the provisional. So coming up, we're going to talk about in topic number 3, what to do over the first 3 months. Things like a business strategy, a marketing engine, or using the provisional as a blueprint for prototypes. There's a whole bunch of things you can do. So we'll talk about that. And then we'll jump to topic number 4, what happens around the 6-month time frame. And here what we have to do is kind of understand the company's point of view. I mean, if you're the CEO or an investor or the CFO or the CTO, you might be doing different things at the 6-month mark. So the evidence of use, for instance, is a pretty important thing that maybe your patent counsel will be looking at based upon the fact that you file a provisional. So around 6 months time frame, your provisional's got some time behind it now, so you can watch, see if the market actually did what you thought it was going to do. So we'll get back into topic number 3 and topic number 4 coming up. What to do in the first 3 months? Now, there's really nothing holy here about 3 months or 6 months or 9 months. I'm breaking it out into places that I think it's reasonable to do. And these are over the many decades of working with clients. These are some of the things that we see happening. Clients will come back after filing a provisional in 3 months and ask these kind of questions, etc. Well, they'll ask different questions maybe after 6 months or so. So within 3 months, it would be very useful to think about creating a business strategy or looking at your business strategy now that the provisional is being filed. I mean, you had a business strategy before the provisional was filed. Now you file a provisional. Wouldn't it make sense to say, now that if I own this IP, what could I do? So linking this kind of provisional as an asset to your business plan might change the way you think about the business. Maybe this gives you more posture against competitors. Maybe you should charge more for your product, etc. Another thing you could do in the first 3 months is create marketing, do a press release, revamp collateral materials. Uh, Certainly, having a provisional filed, you can do a press release right away. But clearly, in the first 3 or 4 months, you should be doing something to actually expand the value of the provisional by talking about it in the market. Another thing you can do is use it as a blueprint to develop a prototype. You've got the provisional. that document can be used to actually hand over to a prototyper to actually, especially in software, to develop the product. So sometimes people use the provisional as an early blueprint for the product. What we've also seen in the first 3 months of your startup company is that you can use the provisional as a startup. And so you can go to our episode number 46, which we talk about is a patent a startup? Well, a provisional acts like a startup as well. And I would really advise go and listen to that because your provisional could be a whole company. Another thing to do in the first 3 months is to is sort of create a workflow that says, let's stay on our provisional space. And what I mean by this is if your company is looking at product generation and developing it in the lab, for instance, maybe every 3 months, take a quick snapshot of what you've done in the product that's different, and then see if it's still inside of that provisional. A great thing to do in the first 3 months, and I'm doing this right now for several clients that have called up, is to do an IP valuation. Now, we have a podcast on IP valuation you can take a look at in the Invent Anything series. But if you basically assume that you're going to get the claims you're going to get, evaluation would be great because it tells you about the value potential you could get if you file a patent. Another thing to do in the first 3 months is to recognize that there's so many non-IP uses for provisionals. Again, we have a whole podcast that outlines in podcast number episode 58 the many non-IP uses for provisionals. It helps with all sorts of things with boards and investors against new employees or for new employees. So take a look at that podcast. Another thing to do in the first 3 months is sort of think about gambling, delaying the provisional being converted. So in the first 3 months, refile the provisional as is. So what that does is it gives you kind of a rolling provisional. This is a trick that we've used forever, that maybe you file the provisional and you file it again because it's only the cost of refiling and those two separate provisional numbers. And that means that you've moved that initial date out because after the year, the first provisional will expire, but the next provisional that rolled into 3 months gives you another 3 months. So this is kind of a neat trick. Another thing to do in the first 3 months is to sort of start a trade secret process and use the provisional as a specification to say, okay, if I was to take this provisional and convert it to a patent, what is the know-how that I know in a trade secret mode that I might want to define? So knowing and documenting kind of trade secrets is important, prior to the filing of a patent. Now, a patent requires best mode, meaning the best way to do something needs to be in the patent. So you may actually use a provisional to know what you're going to claim, but not work on the trade secret portions of your invention until after you file it. So that gives you the patent claims and you meet the best mode requirement, but also now your trade secrets don't have to be in the patent. In the first 3 months, you should really think about this. You should think about filing more provisionals. Now, this may sound kind of crazy, but since you've been successful in filing your first provisional as a business tool, the cost of filing provisionals is not that much. And from a business perspective, it adds so much value that filing 3, 4, 5, 10 provisionals is not a bad play to have all these assets on the book. Let's move over to 6 months now. So the clock moves forward by another 3 months. So you're half a year from the time you filed the provisional. Now, I sort of thought about the best way to describe what I've seen when companies start to call us after the 6 month time frame of filing provisionals. And I seem to get calls from different members of the company. So sometimes around the 6 month mark, I have inventors calling us, and they want to know if their provisional really covers the improvements they've made to the invention since they filed the provisional. So they need like professional advice. And many times they've improved the invention so much that it's not covered in the provisional. So what that does is start to recognize that they need to file more provisionals to cover the new matter, which goes to the earlier thing I just said, is consider filing more provisionals. Another thing is we found in 6 months or so, inventors would actually ask us, that they're working on a prototype. And, if you are working on prototypes or implementing some sort of, prototype, this is really great news because your provisionals could help you really kind of lock in what the prototype's going to look like. So make sure that your prototype looks like your provisional because they interlock, they cover each other. And that would help you with the decision to file as well. So when you get to the point of filing a patent, you've got the provisional file, but if you have a real working prototype, you now know it works. And so filing a patent makes even more sense. A lot of times in the 6 month time frame, we get calls from the CEO. And here what they're actually trying to think about is, has the provisional actually changed the business strategy? Um, is it something that's helped the CEO do a better partnership or a better direction for marketing or something? If not, it's 100% likely the CEO has seen the value of this sort of patent pending and it may not be leveraged. So you have to ask yourself the question, if you're not seeing the leverage of the provisional, maybe this is the double check to say, do you have patent pending on your website, on your press releases? Do you add it to your language when you're talking to people? Because if you don't take the actions that we talked about immediately or in the 3 month time, you're very likely not to get the leverage out. So this is a great time for the CEO to be reflective to see if they're getting the results. And a lot of times CEOs would call and say, John, we've filed this thing 6 months ago, and I'm not seeing, that it made any difference. And then we'd kind of counsel them, well, did you do a press release? Did you put it in your marketing? Did you, start talking about it to your customers? And if the answer is no, they kind of get it that, oh, filing the provisional is not a magic bullet. You have to kind of work on the things afterwards. It makes it more valuable. Another thing is that a CEO's point of view in 6 month time frame is they really start thinking about the time it's going to take and the amount of money it's going to take to file that patent. Filing a patent is not just about the patent fees and the issuance fees, because there's maintenance fees, 3, 7, 11 years. There's continuations, meaning you have a patent attorney trying to file a continuation likely. So patents can start to grow from $8,000 or $9,000 for patent filing to 20, 30, 40, 50, and more. So the CEOs usually starts to awaken to start to recognize that there's a lot of money that could be, put out of the treasury in order to keep this thing going. So this is a great time for a CEO to really take count of this. Now, we work with a lot of investors who ask us to help their clients, their investors get their investments get provisionals. So if you're an investor, you would probably want to ask the question, does this provisional that we have still represent the believable future for our monetization? And a lot of times, 6 months is a great check-in because they can sort of reassess, the provisional, where the market's head and where the company's going to see if there's evidence of use. And what happened here is that sometimes clients will ask us, investors, to do an evidence of use or evaluation to actually see if it was appropriate that the provisional is really taking hold. Another thing investors ask us, usually around 6 months, 7 months, 8 months, is, are competitors validating, the provisional if it could convert it to a patent? In other words, is the market there? So we have a whole bunch of tools and techniques we can use to actually see the provisional, extrapolate the claims, and to see if products are out there for evidence of use. But another thing is you can actually, think about, is the provisional deterring copycatters? We have a whole podcast on how to stop copycatters, and provisionals is one of those things. So one of the things the investor might want to know is, yes, it looks like competitors are not doing what they were doing because the provisional was patent pending. And there's certain behaviors you can look at about competitors, uh, whether they are changing their product direction because of the provisional being filed, or whether they're filing provisionals. We've seen this quite a bit. That when one of our clients files several provisionals, all of a sudden the competitors start doing it where they didn't before. So you can actually see the value of this provisional filing on copycatters. No one seems to care more at the 6 month mark about the provisionals than the CFO. And at this point, sometimes we do get calls from the CFO or the CEO with the CFO on the phone asking us to project the cost. And that's because they're trying to put together a budget. So basically, it is a good financial practice to actually, around the 6 month mark, kind of repencil in the potential cost, because you're going to get closer to making that decision. You don't want the emergency to be, should we file the patent from the provisional? Do we have the money, etc.? Make that decision early on. Another thing is that the CFO could actually, issue an evidence of use study or copycat leverage study, or even see whether the margins of the product should start to change. So there's definite things that are financially impacting the financial part of the company that a CFO might want to consider doing in the first 6 months. And finally, there's kind of like the marketing view of this. I can't tell you one of the most valuable things about filing a provisional is how marketing can use it. Now, some companies are so small they don't have marketing. In other words, the CEO is the marketer. But some companies have marketing, etc. So what we found is a lot of companies that file provisionals don't ever tell marketing about it. So now how can marketing use it? So it's really important to update kind of the value to the market by letting the CEO know or the marketing person know that they really need to be inclusive of putting this in investor decks or customer positioning. One of the people that do call us a lot in the 6 month time frame sometimes is the CTO. Now their point of view is very different. See, they're working on developing the product and they're hopefully developing novel product aspects. So one of the things that they are kind of interested in is my provisional covering what I'm doing. Now, I can tell you that this didn't happen that much in the past, but because of agentic AI, this seems to be happening almost routinely now because AI is moving technology advancements so fast that one of the questions we get more and more from CTOs is I file this provisional. I need to continue to look at it because what I file may be old news in 6 months because of AI. So coming up in topic number 5, we're going to talk about closing out the provisional. There's really two different directions, whether you decide to abandon it or whether you want to go towards publishing a real patent. And so there's a lot of thinking here about doing postmortems and understanding the coverage gap that you may or may not have, and also thinking about, uh, whether you want to file patents and whether you want to do that silently or into the market, etc. And then finally, we'll move to topic number 6, which is what we'll call final considerations. And here, this is where intellectual asset management moves to agentic AI. You see, all the things we just talked about here in the first 5 topics can actually be turned into agentic AI jobs called chronology jobs that they turn on at a certain point. And then actually these things can happen. Updating counsel or investors or product development flags. Even developing sort of an open claw thought here that maybe your provisional in itself becomes an open claw in your organization. Very futuristic stuff. So we'll talk about that. So stay tuned. So topic number 5, closing out the provisional. Okay, so closing out the provisional, one of the first things you want to do is think about should you convert to a patent. And you need to be ruthless here about what the patent would cover and what the provisional covers. Generally, there are gaps, and you should be ruthless here. So your provisional is filed, maybe it's 4 or 5 pages. When your patent gets filed, maybe it's 60 pages. Or maybe the reverse, I don't know. But whatever in the provisional, needs, if you're going to use the value of the provisional filing date, there has to be enough subject matter in the provisional to cover what's in the patent. Now, I'm not a patent attorney. We don't practice law. And you should seek patent counsel advice on this. But, and it is a legal decision whether the claims you're getting in your patent are covered in the provisional. But there's some general rules of thumb here. And generally, what we like to do is we like to make the provisional actually look like exactly what's going to be in the patent, but just lowering the cost of filing the patent, waiting out the year to see how the market goes. But another thing you can do in closing out the provisional is convert it to a patent. But you want to update and add any new matter you can to the patent because it's been a year or 9 months since the provisional. So it's very common practice to add more subject matter. Now, if you add more subject matter and you get claims on that, you may have some claims in your patents that are not supported by the provisional date, and you may have some that are. So just be cognizant of that and understand it. Another thing in closing out the provisional and turning it into a patent is you can publish the provisional to stop others, which may believe where they may believe they're first. So at some point you could file the patent, but then immediately publish the and lay open the provisional. So that creates an opening where people actually can see a provisional. I can tell you about a lot of strategic stuff about that move. Because by publishing a provisional that doesn't have claims issued yet, people might worry more about that than an issued patent with narrow claims. So sort of think about that. Another thing you want to do when closing out the provisional, converting it to a patent, is maybe keep silent. Maybe have the USPTO process not be divulged outside of what you're doing, which is pretty common practice, and let it be a surprise to the market. So big companies and small companies, get to only understand that the patent is issued when it issues. and that could be a surprise to the market. Sometimes the surprise is working against you. You want to get the information out there as fast as you can. Another thing about closing on a provisional is to convert a patent is to figure out what prior art you are disclosing in the provisional that you can't claim. And this is kind of interesting. This is different than what we talked about earlier. This is basically saying you're publishing something that maybe is not enabled in the specification of the provisional, or maybe you can't claim it because of prior art. And that means that you're giving it away, or that people will see it. A lot of people file this omnibus provisional with 50, 60, 100 pages, and then they recognize you can only claim, certain aspects of that provisional. So now they've shown a whole bunch of research in 40, 50 pages of a provisional that they didn't need to do. So again, good patent counsel will help you with this decision, but strategically figuring out what goes in the provisional, and then later on how to disclose the patent from it. You need to understand what's going to be left in this provisional that you're not going to claim, which means you're teaching others, because that provisional will lay open if the patent lays open. Now, you could abandon the provisional totally if you thought that nobody in that year, had filed anything. Another thing in closing out the provisional is the word abandoning it. You don't do anything. So, but you could abandon it and just lay it open, create prior art. And there are pros and cons to that. I don't have time to do that. We do have a podcast on enabled publications, which talks about the strategy of why you would outlay and put into the public domain prior art to stop somebody else from patenting on top of you. So a common use of provisionals is to just lay it open and abandon it to create prior art. That would be a very valuable use, because if you don't lay it open, then nobody knows about it. So you spent the money, but didn't get any value except maybe the patent pending and some of the other things we talked about. Another thing you can do in closing out a provisional is abandon the provisional as well. But before you abandon, see if you can sell it. Many people get surprised at this, but I can tell you that we have done a bunch of deals with a provisional where they don't want to pursue it, but they want to put it in a package of something to sell it. Maybe sell it along with the prototype, or sell it along with some other IP you have, or just shop it around to others, because maybe that provisional is something that somebody else wants to buy and then convert it to a patent. Another you could do in closing out a provisional is abandon it, but then maybe write a paper on it. Own the idea in a concrete way in the prior art. So you can abandon the provisional, but then you've got that information, just convert it to a paper. The paper becomes a publication, but nobody has to know that you tried to get a provisional on it. Another thing you could do in closing out a provisional is abandon the provisional, but eliminate the patent pending. Go dark. And you can have the patent pending after abandonment. So the idea is that maybe you don't put patent pending on your website and you abandon it, so it's totally invisible, but you can have the patent pending, after you abandon the provisional, but file the patent. But you can't have patent pending if you abandon the provisional. As soon as you abandon the provisional, the patent pending time is over. Again, I'm not an attorney. You can get legal advice on this. There's a lot of specifics here, but I would suggest that, you kind of get some counsel here. Finally, another thing about closing up the provisional is abandoning the provisional, but then do a post-mortem. Ask yourself the question, we filed this provisional, but now we're abandoning it. Why? I mean, was it the fact that the provisional was written incorrectly? Was it the fact that the market didn't move in that direction? Is your crystal ball not that good? Did you run out of cash? I mean, what's the real post-mortem? Because that post-mortem will help you decide whether you should be filing more provisionals. And if that post-mortem helps, then maybe the next time you file provisionals, you can use that information to help you. So let's move on to finally topic number 6, intellectual asset management and moving to agentic IAM services. So as a final consideration, you should see these things that I just talked about as just workflows in your company. For instance, you file a provisional and you decide to do a press release, right? A press release is a workflow. Someone's got to draft it. Someone's got to write it. Someone's got to approve it. Then it actually has to be published. Let's call that intellectual asset management. That's a small beginning. Do you think it's possible to write a press release automatically from a provisional at some point in time? I think the answer is absolutely yes. You see, with new agentic IAM, you actually can turn most of these things that I've talked about into cron jobs from the provisional. Cron job meaning it happens at a specific time. So maybe in the first week, a publication comes out, for marketing. Maybe in the second week, a little report goes to the board. Maybe in the third week, you actually kick off some sort of evidence of use study. Maybe in the sixth week, you do something else. So each of these intellectual asset management efforts can now be converted into agentic AI software, which is really kind of cool. One of the things about this agentic AI is you can hook the provisional agentic AI workflows to other workflows in the company. So, for instance, suppose you have a workflow in the company where you're automatically interacting with IP counsel, and maybe there's some sort of interlock meeting you have every couple of weeks where you're preparing for it with the counsel. Now, one of these cron jobs based upon a non legal use of the provisional, like a press release, maybe that automatically gets sent to the counsel. So any other external workflow can be enhanced by having your intellectual asset management workflow hooked to it. So with your provisional IAM workflow being agentic, you can change internal workflows or change external workflows. That's really cool. Another thing you could do is integrate into product development sort of flags that tell you about design changes as the agentic AI results become known. In other words, you could literally have your CAD designs and all the things that you're doing in your company be hooked to that provisional agentic AI where they actually can communicate. So basically, your CAD system creates a new development for the product instantiation. It bounces us and asks a question against a provisional agentic AI to see if it's covered. And if it is, great. If it isn't, make a flag out there. Another final consideration is to integrate into marketing flags. You have marketing, it's looking at competitors, it's looking at copycats. Maybe what you do is you tie it back to the provisional agentic AI and say, I'm checking out my competitor, use this provisional to see if they're overlapping. If it is, let me know. And if it is, have a flag. Another final consideration here is consider the value of the process that even if the provisionals are abandoned, did you get competitive information and strategy information in all these different points of view, the CTO, the inventor, etc.? In other words, could your provisional agentic AI workflow, through the process of looking at competitors every month, dump that into some sort of competitive strategy that basically by doing the agentic AI for the provisional, you have in essence created a competitive agentic AI for the company in general. Another thing you can do in final considerations is to correct by make your agentic AI correct by construction. This is sort of a Japanese word called poka-yoke that you make sure these things work directly. I remember the first time I heard this concept in Japanese auto manufacturers versus American at the time in the 80s when they were installing headlights into cars. In the American factories, you'd see a barrel right next to that place where they put in the headlight in the wrong direction and broke the prongs, and so they had to get rid of the headlights and threw it in the barrel. At the end of the day, you'd empty out this barrel of 40, 50 headlights that didn't go in right. Pokio could say that you develop the fitting so that it only goes in one way and it wouldn't break that. So one of the things you can do here in final considerations to be construct by construction is to actually build into the provisional itself an MD file. That's the files that are used in agentic AI to describe some of the context, or a front matter file, and take an MD file, a front matter file of the provisional, and use that to be inclusive in other specific AI agentics. Now, I may be talking past a lot of people on this, but for the people that know, I think you can see it automatically. Another final consideration is each provisional, you might decide to be an open claw. What's that about? Well, I've talked about in previous podcasts how patents and now provisionals can become basically sentient beings. It's covering some context. It is an idea, and then robots get to be used to expand that idea in the marketplace or in the legal space or in the company space, etc. So you could see that the provisional could become an agentic claw inside the company, making internal decisions. Now, again, if I'm talking over your head on this, that's one thing, but a lot of people like myself have open clause in their technology. I'm having a number of open clause now, and it could be that the provisional becomes an open claw in your company. Yeah, it's May 15th, 2026. Maybe this is a little bit too much right now. Come back in May 15th, 2027. Finally, another final consideration is you can hook this into other action automations. Anything you can think about. So you take your agentic AI for the provisional and tie it into something. Tie it into a recognition and award event, right? And as soon as the provisional is out there, if the product is still covering it after 6 months, the inventor gets an email from the CEO to say, thank you very much. Your provisional is helping the business a lot. There's so much you could do with this. So I hope I painted the picture here. And I think in this last topic, number 6, final considerations, I want to say this. Maybe I'm too futuristic. Maybe I'm not. Maybe this is all going to happen. It's kind of fun to think about it. But I clearly see this. I clearly see this whole idea of agentic AI processes inside of companies, you know, guided by things like strategy or business or finances. I mean, my CFO today has developed a bunch of agentic AI to manage our workboard and our cash, and it's just getting better and better as he's connecting it to things. So why couldn't the provisional, or a patent have an agentic AI, and why couldn't that be connected the same way? So let's wrap up. In topic number 1, I said, let's take stock. What kind of a provisional do you have? And I talked about things here, like, was it something that you did where you just think I filed a provisional with blanket covered? I talked about this sort of scenario where, it was a rushed event or it was covering a product or a future placeholder, or whether it's a monetization play or an investor play or some sort of market validation. Taking stock of the very reason you filed the provisional will guide you about what to do with it next. In topic number 2, we talked about the immediate things you want to do. I mean, like immediate, within weeks in the first month. Things like creating some sort of early leverage by making sure that you talk your patent counsel, understanding claims and costs, maybe positioning in the company's operation and messaging, building an IP story, building it for investor presentation, maybe using it with a patent watch system or do an inventor round, or use it for posture in your business. We talked about a lot of different things there. Then we jumped to topic number 3 to what happens in the first 3 months. And here we learned that 3 months, again, this is not holy, but around 3 months, maybe about after you file the provisional, maybe you want to think about, we talked about transforming that provisional into the business for IP execution and business strategy or marketing prototypes or starting up evaluation or using it to kick off the trade secret process or using the rolling provisional strategy or making sure you stay on your provisional space or just making sure that this asset that you've created is actually keyed into your product development or your long-term strategy. Then we said after about 6 months, the point of view changes here because now what happens is specific different people in the organization might pop up with different reasons to talk to you about what you should be doing with the provisional. The inventor, of course, wants to know if their invention has changed very much from the time they filed the provisional to today. And a lot of times I'll get a call from inventors that basically say, hey, my invention's changed. I need to update the provisional. We talked about the CEO and the investor and the marketing and the CTO and all these different reasons from business strategy to monetization to how the technology shifts to competitors shifting and talking about the position against copycats. So if you went back to topic number 4, 6 months, you'd find that there's a lot of different points of view and a lot of people concerned or maybe even more thinking about did we get the value out of this provisional and have we continued to get the value out of it? In topic number 5, we talked about the very ending of where the provisional is towards the end of the year. It's either going to be abandoned or it's going to be filed as a patent. We talked about some of the things you could do there, looking at the gaps between what's in the provisional and what's in the patent and doing some sort of post-mortem there. See if there's new prior art, there's more exposure. Seeing if you understand the trade secrets. If you're going to file the patent, don't put your trade secrets, into the process yet. Do it afterwards to get the best mode into the patent, but then you have trade secrets after that. Think about when you're publishing and staying silent. We talked about having defensive prior art. We even talked about things like how to apply these post-mortem lessons to the next provisional. And finally, for topic number 6, we talked about intellectual asset management, which is really a workflow, moving into agentic workflow. And we talked about here is really the future here. We talked about agentic IAM services, turning that provisional into a repeatable robot, whether it connects internally to your own AIs or whether it's external, writing cron jobs to things, and hooking it to the IP counsel or investor relations or the business side. And even getting to the point, if you're this futuristic, thinking about how to make things correct by construction, developing an open claw on a provisional in your company, maybe a wild idea. I talk about today's date as 5/15/2026 and come back in 5/15/2027. So there's so many things that are going to happen in the next 6 months even on this. So I hope you enjoyed this podcast. And if you filed your first provisional, I really hope that all these things we've talked about can help you. But I know that so many people listening to this podcast, if you've listened to this the first time, You probably have filed a provisional. You didn't recognize you could do half of the things I talked about. And there are a lot more things you could do, believe me. So, if you need any help, just let us know. And remember, if you like and subscribe, and join us, and join our blog on Invents Anything, and even join our channel with Inventors at Work. This is John Cronin, Invent Anything.